Welcome to another episode of Nuggets with Sauce, the podcast dishing up bite-sized insights you can sink your teeth into, served with a saucy take on common leadership challenges by your host, Michelle Arentz. Oh, this is so awesome. I am so chuffed and excited. It is another episode of Nuggets with Sauce, and I am over the moon excited to have with me today as my wonderful esteemed guest, Jonathan Lopez. Jonathan, welcome. Welcome to the show.
Thank you,
So glad you're
Michelle.
here. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well, and this is going to be fun. This is going to be saucy. So
I think so, because any conversation I've ever had with you has been rather saucy of a variety of flavors. So I am looking forward to this. You're looking wonderful and official and exciting and everything. So I want to get gangbusters going here for our watching, listening audience and say, as you know, we don't use job titles around here at Nuggets with Sauce. So I'm just going to ask you straight up, what is your magic mojo in this world? What is your purpose, your passion, the thing that gets you out of bed every day and says, I'm going to make the world a better place? What are you doing there?
the everyday morning push that gets me excited is to lead with curiosity and learn something new. But then now that has developed into now build something new. And what we are, I'm not going to give you my title, but you'll figure it out. What my mission is to flip the law firm economics model on its head and redefine what value a law firm provides to clients, how we do our work as professionals, how we actually can balance work and life in a very hyper competitive environment, and building out a law firm that actually facilitates all of that as opposed to trying to feed the people at the top necessarily. So on the client end, making sure that we're focused on the value they're receiving, making sure that it's not just about pumping up billable hours. And so that if I can affect the industry, not just build something fun and cool, but actually affect the industry, affect talent acquisition, client business, what the expectations are as far as hiring lawyers and law firms, then that will be a mark that I leave. And that pushes me every morning to be excited to get that done.
See, this is what I really like about you. And I'm just sitting here thinking, in a slightly different time, in a slightly different place, I think they would have burned you for heresy for saying the things that you just said. So I love how you're challenging the model right there. I mean, we're going to have to unpack some elements of that for sure. I love that. Before we get down that path, though, oh, I can't wait. Got a recommended read, watch, or listen?
I am on this journey of leadership, and part of why I'm on this podcast with you and figuring out how to develop better leadership, how to myself improve, but also how to discuss this with other people in a different manner. There's this misconception, I think, that entrepreneurs, startups, small organizations need to have the perfect product or the perfect marketing, and that's the determinant on success or failure. But it really, more often than not, the through line is actually the leadership. And so a really fun podcast that I like to listen to, and there's some great episodes based, and so they're biographies. It's the podcast called Founders, and it's synopsis of biographies, written biographies, and then what we can take from people that have actually excelled at building companies from the ground up or taking over the leadership. But then a lot of the focus is how they actually figured out how to be better leaders and drive a firm or company forward, and not necessarily just, well, they figured out a key tech component and that's what flipped everything, or that was the turn, right? Mm-hmm. A lot of times you talk about Steve Jobs and you're like, well, it was the iPod, right, that flipped everything. But there's so many leadership qualities behind that that were really the true determinants of why that worked, as opposed to just create a new product that's fun and everybody's excited
what
about.
Environment did he create that made that possible? I love that. So Founders, that sounds awesome. And again, I just always want to challenge everybody who's watching or listening, broaden your horizons, think about or look into some of these things. And I bet you find too in that, because I found in some of the things that I've looked into, and I haven't heard that podcast series yet, but what always strikes me about a lot of these folks, and maybe this is where we can start our conversation and see where we ramble off to, but how many of those leaders, founders, leaders, whatever, had just epic frickin' fails? You know, they didn't just show up one day and like everything worked, you know, they screwed up. Some of them screwed up royally. How many of them had businesses that failed or bankrupted, or, you know, some of these people are like serial failures, you know, don't always get it right, but where they, you know, and it's not just up to them, right? But they set in motion the kinds of things, you know, it wasn't just that Steve Jobs by himself didn't invent the iPod or anything Apple for that matter, as far as I know. Correct me if I'm wrong, I could be wrong, but you know, somebody out there will tell me if I'm wrong, I know it. But
there's a Johnny Ives out there, so watch out.
But these are people who, from a leadership quality perspective, like you're saying, are smart enough to know, like, you get the right people around you, you create the right circumstances as a leader to let shit happen that then becomes the thing that either turns the company around or makes the company flourish, right?
Yeah.
Which
you also need to push the right buttons and also expect failure sometimes. As you mentioned earlier, failure is so much a component of getting a company off the ground, or as a leader, developing your leadership skills and improving, because you have to learn from those failures, right? And so instead of being afraid of them.
Stop right there. Learn from failure? No,
well,
we're going to fire
and I would
your
even
ass
take
for
it to
failing.
the next level. I'll take it to the next level.
Fire you. You failed.
I would say welcome failure. Like you obviously it hurts to have it destroy you, but welcome at least the small failures, because then you really take a lot more out of that than no adversity, pure successes. What are you getting out of that? Because eventually something's going to knock you on your feet if you haven't learned some lessons along the way. So I've been having some conversations, and somebody categorized it as weaponizing failure, using those failures, welcoming them, so that then you can take much more out of it and then become much stronger as a company, as a leader, whatever it might be.
Yeah, and let's be very clear on that concept, that by weaponizing failure, we're not saying use it as it like, oh, your failure, I'm going to use it against you, I'm going to punish you with it, right? It's about saying, how do we learn from that failure, move forward and do something differently? Do you not find, though, that a lot of people, very fearful people in leadership positions, and as you know, I interchangeably use management and leadership, and you know, maybe that's my own heresy, but how many people are in those positions who are like, you can't fail, and if you do, like, I want to punish you for your failure, you screwed up, don't ever do that. How many people are afraid of failure because the system's been set and the leaders have been set, and you know, we learn down the line that, like, don't do that. Oh, failure is a miserable thing, you know?
I'll reveal a little bit about myself. So there are so many times I catch myself where being a leader, being a business owner, being a professional has so many overlaps with being a father, a parent. And we would never teach our children, my own children, I don't teach them to learn big things by only having successes at it. It's about the practice, the failure, the attempts, the reattempts.
Yeah.
And then finally they get somewhere maybe they weren't expecting to be able to do that, right? I know you and I have had a conversation recently of what my daughter did and was able to accomplish, to my surprise.
Right.
And there's so much overlap with leading companies and leading teams, is that you should allow them to have room for small failures at least, with no, and then the big failures, let's make sure we tackle those and address those.
Right.
But to not give your team space to be able to try something. I think Steve Jobs uses it as a two-way door, right? You can always try something. Most doors, I think his statistic is more like 95% of doors are two-way doors in business. You can try something, see if there's success there. If it's not going to work out, then we just walk back through the door and get back to where we started from. And there's some cost to it, but it wasn't detrimental to the company. Right. There are a few doors that are one-way doors. Once you go down that road, there's no coming back, right? Any mistakes are really going to hurt the company. But most of these doors that we're talking about, that we're afraid of, right, that we are just so fearful of maybe even considering, because of the dangers and risks,
Yeah.
we can always come back from them.
No, I love what you're saying there. I mean, you're echoing another conversation that I had in another episode of and you and I know Andy Height, right? And Andy and I talked about, I love how you picked up that thread on the parallel between the parenting and the leadership. Like, again, if you've got little kids, I mean, if the first time they went out and tried to, run or ride a bike or whatever it is they're doing, if we screamed at them and said, "You got it all wrong. How dare you?" They never touch that stuff ever again.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So we have to think about it from that level. And also, I love the idea of the doors. How many of us are afraid to even knock on the door? How many of us have been discouraged from, like, don't look at the doors, right? Yeah, there's opportunity behind it. Be cautious about it. But as leaders, for us to, create these spaces where people are encouraged to open some doors, stick your head in the door, maybe step through. To your point, most of them you could walk your way back out. Maybe what you find in there isn't the right thing. But unless you're going to let your people feel safe and comfortable and supported, and knowing that maybe I knocked on the wrong door, I opened the wrong door, but it's okay. I can back out and shut the dang thing. But how many people are just like, nah, I'm just going to stand in a hallway full of doors and I don't want to touch any of them.
It comes back often to there has to be some guidance, right? There has to be some parameters, and explaining those to the team and to yourself. I think it comes back to having clear standards or principles. If everybody understands that, again, this is a parenting methodology too. So if you can set where the boundaries are or what the expectations are, as far as we have true core principles that we cannot violate, but anything within that space, you're free to explore, right? Then we can all be pushing the same direction. We can all know, or at least expect, how people are going to behave or what the intention of a certain thing is. If the intention is client value, how we can improve client values, that might sacrifice some of our profit, but we're going to be creating a lot more value, right? That's the core principle that we have. If your principles as a company or a leader are different, just make sure that that's communicated and other people will be following along the same track.
Yeah.
If that's not communicated, though, you're going to have 10 different people going in 10 different directions and no control. So.
Well, and I think that's so important, right? When we think about this, it's like, let's be clear, what culture, this is all the underpinnings of the culture and how we get things done around here. It's not just what are we doing? We have to think about how do we do it and why does it matter? So where are the guardrails or the parameters around, you can go this far. This is safe and okay. If you think it's going to go beyond that, maybe you should be asking some questions, like it's not a giant free for all, but we also shouldn't clamp down to the point that nobody can make a move on anything. Make that clear and make that part of your culture. And that means, to your point, communicate that. Like, how many times do we think it's one and done? I said it. You should have memorized this. It was part of your orientation like a year ago. We mentioned something or we threw it in the handbook. Didn't you read it? And people are not being set up for success in that respect either, because leaders aren't necessarily regularly communicating the what, the how, and the why. Hey, it's okay to try these things because, and you're right, it might put the business at risk to a certain degree, but it might also reward it that much better.
An example that I think illustrates a lot of the things in business is using sports analogies or athletics, right? And so
I love sports analogies. I don't know a damn thing about sports, but even I can add this up. So yes, let's get down this path. Please go.
We all understand and we fully appreciate how practice is what gets you to perform better. Practice, just drilling the same thing over and over again, and warming up, not just immediately going from your car to the locker room, putting on shoes, and then jumping on the court, warming up, and then cooling down at the end, right? These are all very clear in athletics. These are all very clear principles that allow you to be better. We never, or most people don't apply any of those same practices to business and leadership. And what you're talking about, drilling that same information, repeating the core principles, explaining over and over again why they're important and why they lead to success in the companies that we lead. So again, repetition, drilling, practice, warming up, getting people ready. it's clear in athletics, but
Yeah.
why are we so different as if we want to be high performing leaders, executives, professionals, why should it be so different for us? The brain is a muscle too, just like
Right.
yeah.
This is why I like you so much. This is why I like it. That drives me crazy. And I actually, weirdly enough, I think about that all the time. In my world, as I like to say, practice doesn't make perfect, it makes permanent. Fundamental difference there, because you could practice something incorrectly and it will stick. Whether that's you're playing something on the piano and you always hit the wrong note, and now you're always hitting the wrong note. That's the permanence to it. In the sports analogy, to your point, drilling, it becomes second nature, but teams have to practice, athletes have to perform, you have to warm up, you have to cool down, you have to prepare. You don't just show up and play. Well, if you do, I guess you could do that. But, my understanding is anybody does that is usually in for some pulled muscles, a lot of pain, and probably some really bad moves that piss off their teammates, right? You didn't know the play. You didn't know what you were doing. You hurt yourself. You hurt somebody else. We wouldn't accept that mostly in the sporting world. But yeah, you're right. In the business world, it's a really wacky model where we think we can just like show up the day of and somehow pull it out of a hat. It's crazy.
It doesn't even have to be very painful, right? When people think, well, I have to practice business principles, well, how do I do that? It could be as easy as what we're doing now, right? These conversations, not
Right.
necessarily on a podcast, but with people around you, other executives, people in a similar roles,
Yep.
other leaders, having conversations to figure out how they're doing things differently, exercising that muscle to explore a slight tweak to what you're doing. That's all practice. That's all repetition in the mind as far as visualizing what you're doing, how you can do it differently,
Yeah.
then play that out in your head, right? That's all practice. These
Yeah.
conversations are helpful.
See, even I know enough to know this. I'm very proud of myself. I think I can say this honestly. Like, okay, let's take football as an example. Good old American football. Every team's a little bit different. Yes, you got a quarterback, but every quarterback's got a slightly different move. Everybody's got a slightly different offensive or defensive plan. But the more you watch different, and you better believe that they're paying attention, different teams are paying attention to the other teams and saying, well, what are they doing a little bit differently? The fundamentals of the game are the same. You can only do so many moves. You can't do anything you want out there. Pretty sure, right? But they're paying attention to that stuff and they're looking around and they're comparing notes and saying, like, hey, you're right. Who's doing something a little differently than what we're doing? What could we learn from that? And that's smart on their part. And you're right. Leaders in business should be thinking the same things. The more you expose yourself to this kind of thinking or this kind of information, the more comfortable you're going to be with it, the more likely you are to be able to figure out ways to use it to your benefit and the benefit of people in your business. Like it comes back to that practice and practice and practice.
Michelle, I have a question for you. You're around leaders and teams a lot more from a professional level as far as trying to work with them to improve. How often nowadays do you still encounter a leader that started one way on day one and is still on day 1075, still the same way, no urge to learn or adapt, and just expect all the rest of the team to just jump on board with him or her because they feel that they are the perfect leader from day one? Do you still see that? I mean, I know that was an older way of thinking. We don't really think that way now, but there must be. Are you encountering much of that, Phil?
Not exactly like that. I'm going to honestly say it's not 100% unheard of, but it is, thank God, going to the wayside. You can't really get away with that so much anymore. That mentality, or and again, this is a very, I think, a hallmark of sort of the intergenerational workforce that we're in now. Who are the most likely people? And again, I'm going to use a broad brushstroke here with love, but where are we usually going to see that? Well, that's going to be our older generation workers who, the way things were in the 80s or maybe even the 90s doesn't fly now. So there's a lot of context to that, but it is quite rare. Most people now would be like, if they are kind of dragging their heels on that, it's because my take is it's a comfort issue. Like, but I like it's easier to sit over here and not make the effort, not do anything, but it's also the most damaging, and not just damaging to the people around that person, but damaging to that person themselves. But it is rarer than I think it used to be, for sure.
I would say it's a little bit outside of that demographic too, sometimes just because of ego. I mean, younger people, slightly younger generations can also fall prey to ego, right? And
Right.
affecting their leadership style. And I don't want to get sued, so I'll just sort of mention there's a certain CEO of a certain space company and the electrified company that really is stuck in the way that he or she prefers to lead. And I just don't see a lot adapting on their end.
Okay, so that person whose name reminds me of a melon. Let's run with that. Interesting, because that person's generation, I believe, is, well, certainly the same generation that I'm in, dare I say. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that person is a man-child. And that person has my take on that is that person has a particular mentality. And I also wonder, when you get to that level of, this is somebody who is profoundly wealthy, profoundly powerful because of where their businesses are and what they've done. I think you're in a bubble in a totally different sense too. How many people are calling this person out and saying, shut the fuck up, enough?
Right.
Okay, you've got the money to buy whatever it is that you want to do, but does it really make sense? And I think that can be sometimes the challenge in some leadership, again, for smaller businesses. I don't think this is necessarily the case, but my take for that person is that's a very psychological thing to that person and their personal development, possibly more so than even like their age and stage in the world. But that's my take on that. But that's but again, that can be very toxic leadership. Like, hey, when you're, one of the bigger struggles I have, in my world, being a learning and development professional, is sitting there trying to get leaders to look at themselves in the mirror and realize, hey, I'm a source of the problems around here. Guess what? You also get to be part of the solution. That's the good news in it. But I have run across people in leadership positions who are very reluctant to accept that, look at that, and then say, I have been making some decisions or making some moves or making some mistakes that aren't necessarily in the best service of the business. And there's no comfort there when you're sitting there going, wait a minute, I'm the one who messed up. It's hard for us to own that. And again, we go back to what we were saying earlier, how do we view failure, personal or professional? How do we view making mistakes? Too many leaders, I think, have been in positions of they're supposed to be infallible. They're supposed to have all the answers and never get it wrong.
I think the industry plays into that too. And I'll bring it back to my industry. The avoidance of mistakes, because that's the expectation as lawyers. The leadership style that tends to affect so many people in my industry, and this is why it's always known that most lawyers make horrible CEOs, right? Because they're good at their profession, but then the way they've advanced through that profession has made it hard for them to learn leadership skills, right? Because it's more of a commander and subordinate type leadership as opposed to a team effort forward, right? And encouraging the people around you to improve and be better. So in certain industries, I think it might be rare. In other industries like my own, it's very common to have people to be very rigid and not have any flexibility as far as how they're going to learn to either adapt as leaders, push the company forward, and as far as either growth or efficiency, so that then they can be better leaders. It goes back to either the profession, the work ethic, the way we've developed, or the personality, right? A lot of times we're drawn into the industries we're drawn into because of the type of people we are, and maybe the type of people that lawyers tend to be makes them really bad CEOs or leaders.
Well, and
and that's the other point. Sorry, if I could,
no,
I'll
yeah,
add to that. And that was the other thing too. I think it tends to make them good managers sometimes because they need to manage matters, projects, cases, right?
sure,
Results. But leaders, there's not, you're not really trying to be a leader in a matter as
right.
much. So there's, I know there's this caveat that you have that there's a lot of overlap, so that term can be used interchangeably. I tend to try and make sure I'm very distinctive if I'm using the word manager or leader, because I think those roles are very different, the responsibilities and the driving forces behind them. And then also the tasks are also
Right.
are completely different. So
Oh, I will
we
fully
might,
own the fact that when I'm saying this, I'm being very aspirational in the sense that, you know, you're absolutely right. Very different roles, very different responsibilities. If we had more managers who could think and act more like leaders, we'd be a lot better off. And there's,
I
you know, leaders are to some degree either going to need to get some good managers to manage their stuff, or they have to learn how to do that. But you're absolutely right in the respect that they're different. I'm being aspirational when I say that let's connect those dots. We would be better off. And I think you're onto something too, in terms of, I'm sure there are, and this is my sense for what it's worth. I think there are certain professions, and when we look at the kinds of professions that would attract folks who are absolutely magnificent subject matter experts, but really lousy at possibly the people part of things. Yes, I would say that the legal field is one of them. I would say medicine is probably suffering tremendously. I have experience, engineering can be horrific at that. And they often tend to be very technical skill sets, right? Like for somebody to be a really good lawyer, what do you got to be really good at? That skill set is not necessarily conducive to being great at the interpersonal stuff in the way that it might need to be a leader or be a good manager. So, you know, when we get these very techno-minded people in these techno spaces, like our melon friend, you also get the challenges of what kind of mindset or personality, plus what's been reinforced. Yeah.
I was having a conversation the other day with somebody, not in my profession, but I also won't get into too many details, but they moved into a very clear leadership role from the role they were at, which had a lot of leadership aspects in it, but now they are at the top as far as the leadership chain, right? And I had some very curious questions as far as to what's the plan, what's the strategy for what's going to change, how you're going to improve, what's the ideas, the innovation, right? If you will. It's not a very innovative field. But what are you coming in as far as some new ways of doing things to better it, the team?
Did that throw them for a loop that you asked them?
We were talking two different languages. It was they could not see how that role was leadership related. It was just managerial.
Oh,
It kept coming back to,
yeah.
well, I haven't identified who I need to fire yet. It's all okay, well, I can't fire them this quickly. And
Nice.
leadership is not figuring out
You to
who
fire.
you need to fire.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah.
Oh God. Yeah. And dare I say, and again, you know, I'm sorry, this is linked to your profession, but I know it's not you personally, but I'll never forget a conversation I had with somebody who was um, having a lot of very frustrating things going on at their firm. This was kind of when we were starting to first slide out of the worst of pandemic, and it was starting to be like, okay, the first chatter around getting back into the building was happening. And in this particular case, it was, you know, the founding senior partner of the firm was just ticked that, like, how come nobody's coming back into the building? We've got offices and so on and so forth. And I asked this person, he wasn't the founding partner, but he was relaying the story. And I said, well, does the founding partner get his butt in the door and come down to the building and sit in the office like he wants everybody else to do? What do you think the answer to that was? No, he loves working from home. Well, what the hell? But you expect everybody else to get their butt down in the building. That's not leadership. I don't know what that is. That's just dumb. I mean, that's very hypocritical. One of the things in my world, I think about leadership is like, if you're not willing to do it yourself, why are you asking other people to do it? You
Yeah,
know? And I don't think
that's
they think
rule
about that.
that's just rule driven. I think that's just, I'm going to set the rules from on high, send them down, dispatch them,
Yes.
and everybody's expected
Yeah.
to follow them.
Not very inspiring. You know, you can say whatever you want, but when you wonder why there's a disconnect and your staff are doing whatever flavor of quiet we're doing these days, are we quiet quitting? I don't know what we're doing anymore, but you know, where they're disengaged and disconnected, look at the leaders. What example are they setting? You know, let's go full circle here. Are they opening doors with enthusiasm and sticking their head in and seeing what's in there? Are they acting like, oh my God, don't open any doors, we don't know what's behind them? And if you do, I'm going to holler at you. I'm going to look around and see who I can fire. Gotta figure out who I'm going to fire. Yeah,
I
well,
think
you
we
will
could
get
go on
those.
this topic. We can go on this topic forever, just trying to nitpick at all these things you and I have noticed as far as the other CEOs and leaders and how
Yeah.
they're trying to make themselves excluded from their own roles.
Yeah, I mean, can you imagine? Let's go back to our sports analogy for a sec. Can you imagine? Okay, whatever, you know, the top coach, the ownership, whatever, changes on a top-notch sports team. Is the first thing in their head when they come into the building is look around and go, "Who all in the team can I get rid of?" Maybe,
In some scenarios,
maybe.
they were brought on because the team is horrible, so they've got to
Right.
revamp it.
I mean,
The
maybe that's
entire
not the best
roster.
analogy, but you know, as often as not, you know, we can blame the coaching as much as we can blame the players. The players are doing what the coaches are coaching them to do.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so if you want to say you either got the wrong person for the job, you hired the wrong whatever quarterback or whatever position you got, or there's something about the leadership and the management and the coaching piece that isn't serving them well.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't pay attention to the stuff, but even I know, and I hate to say this, but I'm in the Chicago area and I don't even want to begin to discuss any of the Chicago sports teams because they're all terrible. I just keep hearing that they're losing. And all I can think in my head, Jonathan, is like, what is going on with their coaching staff?
Yeah, I am.
The players.
It even in sports, it even goes higher than that, right? The ownership, but you're never going to fire the ownership, but the ownership dictates who the general managers and the coaches are, and then that goes. So sometimes it's just a toxic and yeah.
Downhill. Where do those decisions stop? Where do they start? Where do they stop? Somebody's making those fundamental decisions, and you're right, it goes to the ownership. And it's the same in any other business, any size of business you've got. You know, if you are in a leadership position and you think about where you're at, but if you're in the top of that leadership position, you're the owner, you're the founder, you're the C-suite guy or gal, where are you at in terms of your thinking around, you know, leadership decisions? What kind of environment are you creating for yourself and your people? Because they're going to behave accordingly.
Do you think we will solve leadership by Zoom or leadership remote, right? This idea that we need to bring everybody back to the office because it's so much harder to lead them, to instill the culture. Curious question. Where are you at on that?
What comes to mind first and foremost, again, we're going to have multiple episodes. You're coming back, Jonathan. You're coming back. We gotta unpack more of this. My quick and dirty take on that at this moment is simply that I think a lot of the frustration around the in-person versus hybrid versus remote. And by the way, let's remember that very few people in our economy actually have the kind of job that allows them to work remotely. You know, my groceries ain't getting on the shelf with somebody working remotely, right? In that space, I think what has been a couple things that I think have really made it difficult is one, we have to be very deliberate. We have to be very intentional when we're doing what we're doing right here, where you and I are, you know, we're using Zoom, we're talking on a screen. For those who are listening, you know, go to YouTube and you can watch us. Watch me wave my hands around. we have to be very deliberate when people aren't in the room. If I can't blunder into you or just, barge into your office or your cube or, come across you at the water cooler, I have to be more deliberate and work harder to reach out and connect with you. That takes more effort. Okay, so that's item number one, is just it comes across as a bigger energy suck. And we've gotten away with not having to kind of think that way or act that way or divert that energy. So I think that's part of it. The second thing is, most people who are in management and leadership positions have never been trained to do the job. They were struggling enough when they were in person. They were just kind of getting away with it. We were putting up with that sort of a thing. And now it just became more obvious how much harder it was and how ill prepared they were to engage and communicate and motivate and do all the things that, if you're doing it right, you would know how to do, because nobody taught them how to do any of that stuff. And so compound it with, I can't see you. I have a harder time getting connected with you. I don't really know how to handle this. And so, yeah, it's a big 1-2 punch. I'm not sure that just yelling at everybody and saying, get your butt back into the building is the answer. It's the comfort zone that everybody would like to go back to if we could turn the clock back to 2019, and no, we can't.
It goes
So
back to, and it supports your previous comment that it's why it's so important to drill, right? Communicate those core principles. And so if there is a more intentional effort made virtually to make sure that messages come across with a note that's explaining why this is true to our core principle number 3, right? Or it doesn't have to be so robotic, but repetition as far as why we're doing certain things, taking certain decisions, or why we're managing in a certain way or leading in a certain way,
100%.
then that starts to make it very clear. The leadership starts to take effect almost on its own, because people start to understand why certain decisions are being taken.
Yep.
However, the lack of that, the core principles, then gets you making decisions like, in some professions, the forced return back to the office, when really that has no impact on our core principle of how we do business and how we provide value to our clients or our customers, right? And so if the question in your industry, and again, you mentioned every industry is different in how we work, who's involved, and how they can work remote or not.
Yeah.
But in those that can, if it is important to a core principle that it be done in the office, then communicate that. But if it's not, if the core principles are at a higher level or on completely different focus points, then why is there such a requirement or a push to bring everybody back? If it has no impact on our core standards, what we're doing.
Well, and I'll close that out by saying, my understanding, and I get this, and I personally know people who've suffered through this, who've said, I got called in for something in the office. I physically made the point. And by the way, like, we got to drive, there's traffic, there, there's costs in time and money associated with this. Why did you make me get my butt into the building when it turned out that whatever was going on was something that could have been handled any other way? Like, why am I coming in here to get on a conference call? Why am I coming into the building when half my team isn't here today? But again, it's mismanagement, it's lack of guidance, it's lack of leadership, it's lack of the management that says, if your only aim in life is to have physical human beings in the building to, because you're paying for the lease, okay, that's the outcome you're going to get. People are going to show up, but it's going to be way too random. And then people resent that, because I could have done this elsewhere and knocked out a bunch of other things too, instead of, putting my blood pressure up in traffic. And that's where people start to disengage and get disinterested. And then compound that with we don't feel attached to the purpose, the meaning, the value. Like, what do we stand for? Why are we here? Who are our customers? How do I make a difference? Oh my God, this is a whole other conversation in its own right. But hey, I'm just a worker bee down here in the hive. Nobody's going to notice if I'm not around. Oh, yes, we will. But when they don't feel that connection, and their leaders and their managers don't make it clear what that connection is, yeah, then it's just totally random. Why do I have to get my butt in the building? Especially when the boss can't be bothered to get their butt in the building.
I think the dust on this issue will settle in 2 or 3 years. I'm just glad that you and I are on the front edge of trying to take it in a certain direction, or at least know where it's going to settle and try and also start implementing those.
We
those
are
changes.
absolutely going to fight the good fight. We are going to be stocked with all the dust busters and brooms and vacuum cleaners that we can to get this thing sorted out and get ahead of it, because, you know, this is mission critical for anybody who's watching or listening. I mean, you don't have a business if you don't have people in your business. I'm a solopreneur, and let me tell you, if I'm ill and I can't work, there is no business that day. It's that fundamental. So if you're not thinking about what you're doing in leading and managing your people and thinking about the environment that you're creating for them to either get it right or get it wrong and how that's going to be treated, you're never going to get ahead. And there's a lot more dust and dirt going on out there besides the back to office thing, but we're going to have to make that a whole other episode. I can't believe this has just been so great, Jonathan. We're going to have you back. I'm so glad that you've been here today sharing everything. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I feel like we never got to the really saucy stuff, but maybe just these are the normal conversations you and I have, and maybe this just might be saucy to certain people with a little bit of spice.
Let me tell you, there's all different kinds of sauce, and not all of it has to burn your mouth off, right? So I think today was a good saucy day, and you know, if nothing else, I think next time we just crank the heat up.
Let's do it.
All right, awesome. Thanks so much.
All right, take care, Michelle. Thank you.
Yep. Thanks for joining this episode of Nuggets with Sauce. I hope we fed your appetite for insights and information on how to improve your business. Be sure to like and subscribe so you never go hungry for more thought leadership.